Bioethics and medical decisions are incredibly fraught in our society. Arguments about abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia, gender surgery, genetic modification techniques such as CRISPR, which I just learned we'll be talking about right after my talk, care of the poor, vulnerable and disabled, and others are often in the news and debated in Congress and the courts. And for those of you preparing for the medical professions, you'll be on the front lines of these questions. You won't just need to talk about them and vote about them for really short things. You'll need to deal with them in your day-to-day lives. The Catholic Church, in reflecting on these questions, tends to address them in terms of, do I need to get closer?
Yeah, a little louder.
A little louder, okay. Catholic Church tends to reflect on these questions in the language of dignity and human worth. Every human being, we believe, has an infinite dignity that comes to us, there we go, comes to us from God. Our worth is not instrumental. It doesn't depend on what we can contribute or how smart or talented we might be. We don't have to be smart or talented at all. Those arguments have real toll in our society. But often there's another set of arguments that comes out of the question, who should decide? Statements along the lines of, I'm doing this, so it's ultimately my decision. The language of bodily autonomy and bodily choice also have a lot of power, and they're deeply rooted in our society. Another way to put this is that our bioethical questions are frequently resolved by appeals to autonomy, which is a value and a term that I'll be speaking about today. Autonomy comes from two Greek words, autos for self and nomos for law. It could be translated as being a law unto oneself, to make for oneself the laws that you'll follow. It can include that language of bodily autonomy, but it tends to go further. It includes a sense that each of us can and should choose the life that feels most right to us and the life we want to live. It shows up far more widely than bioethics. When we talk about people living the lives they want, discovering ourselves, pursuing our dreams, we often invoke that language of autonomy. And it's not an accident that that should be so, especially in America, because these narratives of autonomy are deeply rooted in the American imagination. Often our most powerful and original stories are about people seeking, finding, losing, or fighting for it. I'm going to look at some of those stories today, and then I'm going to look at some stories that are asking questions about those stories. But I'm going to start with a text that's been immensely influential for the way we imagine ourselves in our country, but is often not seen as a literary text at all. Text that you all know. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These good words, right? We got rid of the king of those words. But they're not the words that come to God. Look back to Jefferson's original Declaration. It begins, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. There are two versions of the preamble. There are a lot of differences we could look at. I'm going to zero in on this one. What's the difference between calling a truth self-evident and calling it sacred and undeniable? What would it mean to call human autonomy sacred and undeniable instead of self-evident? Well, being sacred is sacred if it's been set apart for God, by some special, set apart for some special purpose. Church is sacred, the burning bush and wealth of saints. To say of the truth that all men are created equal and sacred is to say that the living God cares especially for this teaching. Equality and human rights, for this vision of each human being having special rights that cannot be infringed. When Jefferson calls that truth sacred and undeniable, he implies, in other words, perhaps against his better judgment, that it's a revealed truth, that human worth and dignity depend in some way on something beyond our power and understanding, depend in some way on God. It was Benjamin Franklin who changed sacred and undeniable to self-evident. When he did so, what did he change? He didn't remove God. You can actually see here that the reference to the Creator has been added to the final text. But what he did is that he made equality something that we perceive on our own power. A truth is self-evident if, once you understand it, you can't deny it. Most common examples are from math. Something that is, in this case, the transitive property. Once you understand what a statement like this is saying, you know it. It's not really something that can even be reasoned for or against. Self-evidence became incredibly popular in the 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment. Philosophers and thinkers frequently reasoned from claims about self-evident truths. In fact, I've always liked this statement of the issue. You find that philosophers put out claims and make them quite boldly, and then reason from them. Claims about human nature. As a former PhD student, I'm especially sympathetic to this change of, are we losing? Hold on, just a moment. Stuff. All right, we're going to give just a moment to get the stream working. All right. Okay. So self-evident truths, very popular in the 18th century. And one reason they were so popular was because you didn't depend on anyone else to know them. There was something elevated and dignified about this idea that the truths that we know, that we recognize, that we base our society on, are accessible to every person on the basis of human reason. It was a sort of a mark of this, in fact, human equal dignity, that we could all know these truths. Thinkers like Kant and Hume pointed out that an ordinary person, that a king or a noble, was no more aware of universal self-evident truths than any other person. And in fact, this was the genesis of a lot of Enlightenment critiques of religious belief. That there was something that seemed slavish about believing something that we couldn't verify on our own reason or our own evidence. So there's something that, especially in the 18th century, feels heightened and noble about reasoning to your own conclusions, acknowledging these truths of universal human dignity as principles of reason, and then acting in accordance with them. Now, we move forward a little bit. We won our independence, spoiler alert, and began forming a new nation. And many American writers tried to figure out who we were and what this new nation would be. What would our literature and culture look like? One of the most influential of these figures was a once Unitarian minister turned writer and speaker named Ralph Waldo Emerson. There we go. A man who was trained for the Unitarian ministry, but resigned his benefice and set up as an independent thinker. Emerson wanted Americans to develop our own literary and cultural and intellectual ideas rather than being dependent on Europe. He wanted something like an American revolution of the mind to equal the political revolution that we'd experienced. In 1841, Emerson published a collection of essays that contains what is probably his most famous piece, an essay entitled Self-Reliance. He wrote at a time when Americans who already valued self-reliance, he was tying in to this valuation that we already placed on our ability to take up things, to move out west, move out to the frontier, break new land, create new farms and then new factories and inventions, to say, no one is going to do this for me, I'll do it for myself. So you notice that valuation on self-reliance is largely practical and economic.
But Emerson advocated a self-reliance of the spirit. He wanted us to think, believe, act, create, and worship in ways that were for each of us distinctly ours. He praises the voices which we hear in solitude, which come from deep within ourselves. Those voices speak our truest selves, so he thinks. Our happiest, most fulfilled, most authentic lives come from listening to those voices and living in accordance with them. Yet somehow we find ourselves, most all of us today, alienated from those truest voices. How does that happen? Society, the norms and customs that govern our lives, is Emerson's answer. The voices that he was speaking of, did I go backwards? I went backwards. Excuse me. Those voices he was speaking of grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world. Society everywhere, in a famous line, he says, society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder to surrender the liberty and culture of each, of the eater. What's he saying there? So if I discover my truest self, my most creative and original self, by probing my thoughts in solitude, when I go out into the world, I have to make compromises, or I frequently end up making compromises. Gradually, society infects me with its values. I forget the thoughts and ideas that are truly my own. Thus, the American Revolution of the mind doesn't just declare independence from European ideas. In it, each person would declare independence from the thinking of all those around us. Emerson proposed a radical connection between truth and each individual's personality. Later in the same essay, he remembers, or he may have made this conversation up, a conversation with a fellow Unitarian preacher who objects to Emerson's trusting and relying on those sort of deep instincts that are his by asking, but these impulses may be from below, not from above. Emerson replies, they do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my own nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it. That's Emerson's self-reliance of the spirit. In the world he envisioned, people would not conform themselves to what the world tells them they should be. No one would tell them what they should or should not do. They would be, in other words, they would rely on that deep-seated sense of who they should be and be a law unto themselves. They would be autonomous. You can see the echoes of Emerson's ideals all over our culture. You know the Frank Sinatra song, I Did It My Way? Or how about Elsa from Frozen, who sings, no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. The Godfather is the tragedy of a man who tries but fails to escape the ways of his family. And in the 19th century, Emerson's account of America as a nation of self-discoverers was wildly influential. I'm going to skip a little bit because of the time we lost getting going. I don't want to sort of track through all of these, but I can give you a whole bunch of folks who were deeply influenced by Emerson. You've got Harriet Beecher Stowe over on the far side, and then Margaret Fuller was a great transcendentalist writer in New England. Under her, over here is Henry David Thoreau, who went out to Walden Pond to live by himself and discover truth through that escape from society. The top right, we've got Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist thinker and speaker, again, deeply influenced by Emerson, his notion of discovering oneself, and then Walt Whitman, who became America's national poet by saying that I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I declare, you shall declare. Spend a little bit of time on one particular Emersonian text, although again, I'm going to sort of move through this as quickly as I can. Story you probably a lot of you read in high school or at some point in your college experience. Certainly, I hope you did, because it's one of the great American novels. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is about this 12-year-old boy, Huck, living in Missouri in the 1840s. He's essentially an orphan, adopted by a kind woman who tries to raise him, tries to teach him to eat with a knife and fork, and to go to church and go to school. She's not very successful at any of these things. And finally, Huck runs away and sets off down the river, where he meets Jim, an enslaved man who'd escaped from a farm nearby to Huck's town. They travel down the river together. As they're going, two things happen. There are episodes in which they are together on the river, living in the natural world, hunting and fishing and learning from one another, having a good time, sort of discovering a kind of natural identity in society. And then there are moments where they go to land. Whenever they travel to land, they run into social organizations and expectations that are always exploitive, cruel, and foolish. Well, eventually, Huck is forced to make a choice. By befriending Jim and helping him escape, he's done something so so he has been taught stealing. He's ashamed of what people back home will think of him, and he's been taught that boys who steal go to hell. He can either turn Jim in, and he thinks about doing that and even scrawls a note to the woman who owns Jim, telling her where he is. But then he considers his conscience. He thinks about all the good times he and Jim had together. He thinks about the things that Jim helped him with, the scrapes Jim helped him get out of, and how kind Jim has always been to him. He tears up the paper and says, "All right then, I'll go to hell." Huck's declaration that he'll go to hell is his declaration that he'll live by his own lights, not someone else's. And so you see what's happened here is that Emerson's idea of autonomy has become a story. It's been embedded in narrative form, and we've started to have stories of people emerging from their origins in societies, and the sort of the story of maybe the meta story, the great story of the American emergence is this emergence from a past that we brought with us from the old world, and then moving into a society in which we'll discover and live by our own lights. I'm sure you can still see the power that Emerson's idea has today, but I do want to move to some stories that are questionable, whether they're suspicious of it. I don't want to say that Emerson's idea or that the idea of autonomy is entirely wrong, but I do want to suggest that it sometimes guides us overmuch, and that there are some valuable questions that in particular the Catholic imaginative tradition in this country has raised about it. I'm going to turn first to probably the greatest American Catholic writer, a young woman named Flannery O'Connor. Well, I shouldn't call her young, but I guess she died young, so she always seems young in my mind. Flannery O'Connor, show of hands, who's read O'Connor? Should I ask that? Go ahead and read O'Connor. She'll knock you on your butt. She's really fantastic. Born in Savannah in 1925, she grew up in a tiny Catholic community in deeply fundamentalist Georgia, went north for an education, ends up in New York City in her 20s, beginning to write stories. Meets, while she's in New York, essentially a whole cross-section of major mid-century American intellectuals. Then in 1952, disaster struck. O'Connor was diagnosed with lupus. Lupus. The disease was still poorly understood at the time. Her prognosis was not good. You'll see right here in the picture that she's walking on crutches. She walked on crutches for most of the rest of her life. She moves back to her family farm in Milledgeville, Georgia, where her mother had to help take care of her for the rest of her life. She lived only 12 more years. While she was there, she wrote some of the finest and strangest stories in American literature. Her stories are often violent and shocking. She writes about murderers, terrorists, arsonists. When she writes about ordinary people, they always seem to end up getting shot or stabbed, or in one story, gored by a runaway bull. But she's always engaging with this American myth of autonomy and self-determination. What does she have to say about it? Her final novel, which we're going to look at today, the 1960s, The Violence Bear It Away, starts out as a classic, though extreme Emersonian story of a boy trying to escape what he's been taught by his family and religion in order to find his true self. The protagonist, Francis Marion Tarwater, is a kind of updated Huck Finn. He's raised on this remote farm in Georgia by his great uncle Mason, a preacher, who gives him a fundamentalist education and charges him to be a prophet. He promises Tarwater, right? He promises that he'll be a prophet. He gives him a mission too. Tarwater is going to find his 8-year-old cousin Bishop, a mentally disabled boy, and baptize him. Now, Tarwater has mixed feelings about his call to be a prophet. On the one hand, being a prophet is awesome. There's something exciting about it. He looks forward to the visions he's going to have. But on the other hand, he wants to choose the terms of his vocation. He thinks that baptizing a young boy is altogether too meager for someone as special as him. And most especially, he does not like that his prophetic call is going to be dependent on someone else, namely on Jesus. When Tarwater is 14, his great uncle dies, and Tarwater sets off for the city to escape Mason's teaching and live life for himself. Like Huck Finn, he's bothered by a bad conscience about the things that Mason taught him. In particular, he's been taught that drinking liquor is from the devil. Along the way, he meets a strange, devilish man who sums up the struggle before him in this way. This question about whether he should drink liquor, this question about whether he should follow his great uncle's teaching or not. It ain't Jesus or the devil, he says. It's Jesus or you. In other words, the choice is to follow Jesus or to live your own life as you choose. In the city, Tarwater finds Bishop. It finds Bishop because he seeks out his uncle, Bishop's father. I'm going to give you the family tree real quick. Finds Tarwater's uncle, Raber, a school psychologist. And O'Connor's depiction of Raber is crafty. Raber is an atheist, and he avows a cool self-contempt, a cool contempt and self-control for what he thinks of as his uncle's, Mason's, superstitions. But the truth is that he is boiling with anger and hatred at God. Religious acts, statements, and symbols call up strange, neurotic anger and threaten to make him lose control. O'Connor would have understood Richard Dawkins. Years ago, Raber caught Mason conducting a baptism and claimed, "That can't even irritate me. It can only make me laugh," which is exactly what he should say if he's the person he claims to be. Because if baptism is only an empty ritual, sprinkling some water on an infant who can't possibly remember it, it doesn't have any significance. But a moment later, he's rushing across the room, screaming in his uncle's face, his own face red. He's lost control at the very image of baptism. Raber, who's a psychoanalyst, has repressed something in the classic Freudian sense, that he drove a frightening desire downwards and developed a neurosis to protect himself. But he hasn't repressed any of the things that Freud tells us people repress. There's no repressed sexuality or repressed aggression or sense of self-aggrandizement that he can't face. He's repressed his desire for God. He longs deeply, overwhelmingly, for the love of God that he experienced when he was a boy, and for just a few days he stayed with his great uncle. But he knows that to accept that love would obligate him, would strip from him the ability to live the life that he wants. So he fights it. We can see the conflict in Raber most clearly when you look at his son. Remember that Bishop has a severe mental disability. The boy never speaks in the novel. He doesn't seem to be able to speak. We're told that his mind will never develop beyond that of a child of about 3. Raber says that the boy should be euthanized, killed in as painless a way as possible, because he can never live a worthwhile life. Raber has actually tried to do it. The language in which he speaks echoes that Enlightenment philosophy and that sort of Emersonian reasoning about self-direction and self-control that we looked at earlier. If our dignity comes from our reason and choice, then a person without reason and choice has no dignity and no right to life. So Weber has in the past resolved to kill the boy. In this reasoning, he's actually echoing an argument that Immanuel Kant makes about the killing of animals. Kant, this is sort of a sidebar, but I think it might be useful. Kant was against the killing of animals, but he didn't think that animals had any moral worth in themselves. The only reason you shouldn't kill or torture animals, Kant thinks, is that doing so does some harm to you, not that they have any worth. Weber thinks the same thing about this child, his own son. But here's the thing that I think is most interesting about this book. He can't do it. He attributes his inability to a failure of nerve, but the truth is that his son is a sort of icon for him. If anyone is familiar with the Eastern Christian tradition of icons and the way that they serve as windows into the divine, that's what Bishop serves here. He's a window that opens up God's love. Here's a passage of Weber's internal monologue when thinking about his son. Moments would still come when, rushing from some inexplicable part of himself, he would experience a love for the child so outrageous that he would be left shocked and depressed for days and trembling for his sanity. If, without thinking, he lent himself to it, he would feel suddenly a morbid surge of the love that terrified him, powerful enough to throw him to the ground in an act of idiot praise. So that idiot line, that is how Weber is thinking about what it would be to give in to this sense of powerful and overwhelming love for his son, which, as we see in the novel, actually stretches out into a sense of awe and wonder at everything that exists. Bishop is the window to that sense of awe and to God's love. But Weber doesn't want to give in to it. Now, what's being said here? And what does it have to do with our original questions? First, Weber wants to live an autonomous life. He wants to live the life that he has chosen. He's an intellectual. He wants to pursue his research. But to do that, he actually needs to suppress his love for his son. Nothing in his reason can make his love for his son make sense. It threatens that life that he's chosen. Now, the way I've presented the issue is the way in which Weber understands it. In order to pursue the life that I want, in order to have an intellectual life, I need to keep my son at a distance. But the way that O'Connor presents this, we see in the novel, Weber actually has it backwards. At his deepest, he feels a love for his son that he recognizes as the starting point for a love of everything that is, and ultimately a love for God. And it terrifies him because he knows it would cost him his freedom. He knows if he were to give into it, he would lose that sense of control over his life. That love is so scary, in fact, that he creates a whole sense that he wants to be an autonomous person in order to keep that desire at a distance. What Weber shows, and Tarwater learns this from him, and Tarwater ends up revealing a similar split self in somewhat different ways as the novel goes on. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it will blow your mind. He too is afraid. He's not afraid of losing his autonomy, actually. He's afraid that deep down he wants to lose it. His true self can be found in his autonomy, but it can also be found in this arguably deeper sense of a desire for love and the obligations that go with love. So you might sum up the point like this. O'Connor doesn't say that autonomy is worthless or wrong, or that it always encourages us to be selfish. But she says that often it's a form of self-deception. It's a story. We cast our thoughts back to Huckleberry Finn and the story, and there are many of these other stories of the emergence of autonomy from a background of oppression and societal control. These accounts of autonomy always end up narrative. And she's saying, well, there might be another story here in which the self-control, the ownership of our own lives that we say we want is actually a way of protecting ourselves from what in our deepest way we want, which necessarily obligates us towards other people. So a little more time here, and I want to turn to one other great American Catholic writer and one other insight that I think is useful in thinking through some of the questions that we're all going to be thinking about. And he's alive and writing today, a man named Christopher Beha. He's the editor of Harper's Magazine, also has written a number of novels. The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, is his most recent. In this novel, Margot Doyle, a gifted but aimless young woman, has taken a leave of absence from her doctoral studies and lives listlessly with her parents in New York. At one time when she was young, she wanted to be a poet, and she really wanted this. She wrote quite a lot, but she sort of lost track of it, and for years she's been unable to trust anything that she writes. She doesn't think she has anything to say. She's a classic overthinking artist, too concerned with recording and understanding her own consciousness to produce anything worthwhile. If there are any writers in the room, I suspect you've had some of the same worries. And by the end of the novel is well named. There are a lot of self-destructive acts in this novel. And by the end of it, those acts committed by all the members of the Doyle family, Margot included, as well as by some of their friends, have wrecked the family's finances, wrecked their relationships. Margot's father, Frank, has destroyed his health with alcohol. She decides to move in with her father into a small apartment, much smaller than the gorgeous New York townhome they'd lived in before, in order to become his caregiver, a man who once meant so much to her, who was gifted, talented, intellectual, was a figure on the national scene, and who now is just a shell of that man. And when she does that, when she sacrifices the things that she thought she wanted in order to take care of him, she finds that she can write poetry again. By making a sacrifice on behalf of another person, she has opened the gates to her creative energy. Why? By moving in with her father, she's done something meaningful. And we use this language of meaningful action, or I want my life to have meaning. I want to do something meaningful with my life. Do you all want to do something meaningful with your life? Show of hand. Okay, good. Nods. Yeah. We use this language often pretty loosely, but there's something there that we're indicating. But I mean it here in actually quite a strict sense. Her action has meaning. It communicates something. The vision of this woman taking care of a father who can never repay her and can never, in a sort of rational enlightenment sense, again, merit and do the things that would seem to justify this care, says something to us about what a human being is, what we're for, and how we should treat one another. It, like Bishop, becomes a kind of icon. Neither Margot nor the author needs to do anything to explain that her action is meaningful. The action itself speaks. She's moved outside of a dead art that was dependent on consciousness. She was wrapped up too much in her own mind, and towards an art that's alive because it rests in a shared reality. It's something, by doing this action which communicates to other people, she can then produce also an art that communicates to other people. Her action speaks just as Raber's decision to care for Bishop despite himself speaks. And it's that sense of meaning, I think, that is what Raber, this is another thing that Raber deep down is afraid of. Actions mean things. I call this the principle of sacramental action because thinking it through, it seems clearest and most obvious when we consider the sacraments. It's sort of a principle that the sacraments are a model for everything that we do. It's a principle that doesn't have a lot of purchase in contemporary ethics, had much more purchase in earlier ethics, but I think it haunts a lot of our actions. And the current generation of Catholic writers is exploring and rediscovering it. So let me give you an example. The church teaches that marriage is a sign of God's love for his people. As Christ and his church are, so a husband and wife are. If that's true, then a happy and loving and fruitful marriage means something that goes far beyond the spouses who participate in it and the children that they might have together. It's a sign for everyone around them that it's possible to love someone truly and permanently, that love that endures is real, and therefore it's a sign of God's enduring love. That's why Gaudium et Spes, a document from the Second Vatican Council, calls sins against marriage disfigurements that obscure the truth that marriage means to communicate. That's a weird thing to say about a sin or about something that's wrong. Not that it does harm, not that it violates some kind of universal principle or law, but that it obscures the communication inherent in the act. But I think that's what both of these writers are exploring, this idea that actions mean things. Raber and Tarwater are actually afraid. They don't want their actions to mean things because those meanings are beyond their control. These meanings are shared. If you commit certain actions, they communicate a message of cruelty or injustice or unconcern, even if you don't want them to do that. If you commit other actions that communicate love and truth, whether you intend that or not. So another way to think of the principle of symbolic action or sacramental action is that all of our actions are a certain kind of icon. There's meaning in what we say, there's meaning in the language we have for one another, but there's also a meaning in the things we do for or against one another. So I see that I'm near the end of time. I'm going to real quickly try to bring this back to some of the bioethical questions that I started with, and then open it up for your questions. I'm a literary scholar, not a philosopher, which means that I'm not an expert in arguments. I am, at least theoretically, an expert in stories. And I want to ask what these stories have to say about some of the questions that you might encounter in your public lives. There's an argument for elective euthanasia, for allowing people to make their own decisions about whether to end their lives, that rests on freedom. There's a pretty natural argument, and you can see how it's connected to those claims of autonomy we looked at in the beginning, that, well, ultimately this is my life, why shouldn't I make the decision? One kind of argument against it would be to question whether it's truly free. We might notice, for instance, that when euthanasia has been legalized, it quickly acquires a soft coercive force where, whether it be state-run health systems or private insurers, tend to, you end up having these systems denying extensive life-sustaining care, but turned around in a kind of grisly way to instead offer euthanasia services. Like, I'm sorry, we're not going to pay for that treatment, but we can offer you this pill. So that argument would be that voluntary euthanasia never really stays that way. Another argument would point out that the choice to end one's life is rarely the free, conscious, rational choice that it seems when we're passing laws in a Congress. If you have the case of an adult, especially one who's not in extreme pain, who chooses to end his or her life, that person might be dealing with severe depression. We might have a question about whether, like, what kind of freedom is actually in play here. Is somebody's choice really an expression of their deepest self? This is sort of the O'Connor, the argument informed by O'Connor. But there's another kind of argument. It's rare and I think hard for our contemporary culture to understand, but I think it's really important for understanding Catholic moral reasoning. And I think it comes up in odd ways when we think about the lives that we're living. And that's the argument from sacramental action. These sorts of bioethical decisions, the decision like euthanasia, is a statement. It states that life is not worth living in pain, or that the sacrifice that we must make to care for a disabled person, the sacrifice that Raber needs to make to care for his son, is less important than the life of that person. The action says something. There is no way for Raber to choose without communicating something. Either he can stay with his son and communicate love, or he can leave him and communicate a sense that human worth is not really worthwhile. But there's no way out of that communication. There's no way to escape the reality that our actions express these meanings. And it's important that the meanings we express not be lies. So I think where I want to end is with an image of Pope John Paul II. You might remember that at the end of his life, he was horribly sick with Parkinson's. He suffered enormously, and there was a lot of talk about whether he would resign the papacy. But he didn't do that. There are some practical reasons why maybe it would have been a good idea. But he thought that what was more important was the image of someone suffering and suffering in love, because it spoke to the world that life is worthwhile even in the midst of pain. It spoke something, it communicated through that experience, through his suffering, he communicated that each of us is loved and each of us is worthy of love, and that life is a beautiful thing even when it is filled with pain. That is where I'm going to end it. I know there was a lot here. I'm looking forward to your questions. So why don't we go over to you? What do we want to do with the microphone, Anthony? Oh, great. Okay.
Our friends on who are virtually joining us.
I've got friends, Teams. There we go. Is this friends on Teams annotate while sharing? You may need to put questions in the chat over here. Yeah, folks are on Teams. If you want to put questions in the chat, hopefully we can see them there. But I definitely want to start with some questions from all of you folks here in the room who are going into, many of you going into biological medical professions, and also here at Seton Hall University.
Well, they're gathering their questions. You really got me thinking about autonomy, an exceptional autonomy. Specifically, there's autonomy and there's autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's autonomy in the sense that I like steak and I'm going to chase down steaks. There's the autonomy. I like to go to the beach and I'm going to the beach. But we get to things like killing and stealing, fidelity in marriage. It seems to me that the natural law is imposing on us a hard stop to that autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And in that regard, for most of us, there's a sort of deception of autonomy there. So, rightly or wrongly, thank you for leading me to this.
So there Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point, that there are certain actions where we recognize a generalized autonomy, and then there are certain actions in which we tend to recognize that there are sort of built-in obligations. So something like marriage or something like that, you shouldn't kill. But I guess I would maybe complicate that distinction a little bit. First, by saying that I think it's important to our understanding of why we don't kill, why we don't commit infidelity, why we don't steal things, that it evokes something, it says something, it means something about who we are and the kind of society we want to live in. And second, that those meanings actually stretch into some what seem like everyday things. So absolutely, I love steak too. I'm not gonna, you will never hear me speak against eating a good steak. But there can also be moments in which we take a relatively ordinary action, but end up communicating something that we want to, that's very powerful, or that we don't mean to. So, all right, I'll give you another sort of sacramental action example that I like. Suppose that your father is a handyman. He really likes sort of working around the house and working on things. And you notice that his drill is old and worn out. You make a note of this. You drive to Home Depot, maybe you spend a little time on the internet figuring out what drills are really good. Maybe you listen to him and he happens to mention, oh man, that would be a great drill. But you also know, this is your dad, he's never going to buy that drill himself. So you take yourself to Home Depot and you buy the drill and you give it to him one day. What's important about that action is not the drill. The drill is absolutely the same as if he had bought it for himself. What's important is that it communicates your love for your father. It's a very ordinary action. It's an action that nothing obligated you to take. But it is in actions like that that we build up a sense of communication gradually over time. We build up this sense of meaning. If we think back on that question of what it is to live a meaningful life, and I've got you all on record as wanting to live meaningful lives, it's in those actions that communicate that we do build meaningful lives. And you also had the option to notice this and then just kind of, I didn't get around to it. It's not a moral wrong to not buy your father a gift, but it's it's a kind of opting out of the ongoing communication that is a moral life. So I guess I think that something like the action to go to the beach or the action to buy a steak, I'm not exactly sure what that is going to mean, but there are circumstances in which it would communicate something that we want to communicate, or in which it would not communicate something. Okay, so on Friday, you don't have that steak because it's Lent, and you're honoring the sacrifices that Christ made. There's no end accomplished by not eating the steak on Friday. There's no like utilitarian good that can be seen in doing that. But there's a meaning that's communicated of saying, well, this is actually this sort of the meaning of this decision is more important to me than the steak that I happen to want to eat. So yeah, so I guess I want to suggest that even insignificant seeming actions get taken up into this sort of process of meaning, which I don't think you were denying at all. Anybody else? I'd love to hear from some students in the class. Is there anything that you were just wondering about, confused about, would like further elucidation? Any stories, novels that you've read that you think maybe speak to this? Or do you have questions about how these kinds of concepts might address some of the bioethical concerns that you all are thinking about? I see some head nodding, so
Questions for our teams, people on teams?
I'm having a hard time getting, please post questions in the chat. Who wants to? Are we seeing them?
Yeah, I can see them online.
Gloria, can you see any questions from there?
No questions.
Yes.
Students aren't asking a question.
All right, have at it.
Okay, I'm just hearing about your talk, for me right away, and just going through the 45 minutes, autonomy versus free will.
Versus free will.
One is autonomy is our own desire, free will is from the creator. Maybe that's the way we should start, to separate in our own lives, to understand what we have to do in an ethical manner. Is that a good thing to go? Is that a good place to go to?
I like that. Okay, but I'm going to throw it back on you. So what are the implications of talking about free will rather than autonomy? So you said free will is from the creator, autonomy is our own. What is freedom if it's not autonomy?
That's right. But people have forgotten that it's a gift of free will from the creator. Now the world told us that it's your autonomy, like going through the whole history, even starting with the rough draft in the final text of the Declaration of Independence and moving on to Emerson. And interesting about Flannery O'Connor, I studied this book at a secular university at Rutgers, and I understood mistaken for nihilists. That's right. They didn't even talk about a Catholicism when they presented that book. It was totally convoluted to what you said. I had a totally different view of that. Yeah.
So a funny thing about O'Connor is that I put that line on there because when her first book was published, reviewers almost uniformly assumed that she was a kind of French-style existentialist nihilist. That is how the book was read. It took quite a bit of time for readers to understand the Catholic vision behind the book. And I think that this distinction as well between autonomy and freedom can be difficult to grasp. If freedom does not mean doing what I want, well, what does it mean? And I think it means, I would say two things. It means participating freely in that shared action of making and exchanging meaning. So I was talking about sort of the way that our actions mean things, and the way that we can choose. We've got a set of things that we can communicate, an enormously varied set of things that we can communicate by different actions. But we can't define those meanings for ourselves necessarily. So just as in a language, there are a whole lot of words in English. Some people say there are too many words. And we can make all sorts of meanings by putting those words together, but we can't actually make words mean things that they don't mean. We're sort of working within a created context. The second thing I would say is that freedom, think about dancing. Does anyone dance here? Show of hands. There must be some dance. There we go. Okay. What's your dance style back there? European folk. Love it. Okay. I've done some European folk. Mostly I'm a swing dancer. I've done some waltz and some salsa and some other things. No salsa dancers in the room? Yeah. Okay. All right. So weird thing happens when you learn any of these styles of dance or hip hop or ballroom blues, whatever you want. You get a big class full of newbies together, and you're learning to dance some set style. Instructor gives you some basic moves, and you go at it, and nobody is very good at it. Everybody's sort of trying out various things and figuring their way around. But the instructor can predict all of the mistakes they're going to make. Anybody who's been teaching any of these styles for a while sees, okay, well, I'm teaching a new swing class. I know that people are going to be off on the rock step because that's just, people do that all the time when they're learning it. What you've got is a whole bunch of people who actually are not free to do the dance that they've come to learn. Then you keep coming back and you keep practicing and you get better. You stop making the errors that the instructor can predict. And then at a certain point, you start doing new things within the dance that the instructor can't predict because you've mastered the dance well enough that you're able to innovate and experiment within it. So there's a point at which you become free by incorporating the principles of the dance. And I think human freedom, real human freedom, is actually a lot more like that. That we internalize and master a set of habits and practices of which human morality is sort of the core or cornerstone, and we eventually make it our own, so that doing good becomes a kind of mastery of a certain dance. That, I think, I mean, you could use other skills as metaphors as well, but what I think that gets at is that freedom is in some way something that we learn. And we might look free before we've learned it, but we actually discover freedom as we're mastering essentially the practice of being good. Does that make sense? Let me hear from one of the dancers in the room. You guys must have questions. Yeah, you're wanting to ask a question. Why don't you go ahead? What's your name? Ricardo, thank you.
So I was thinking about when you brought up euthanasia.
Yeah.
And just for someone who's a Catholic
Uh-huh.
and they are struggling with the autonomy behind deciding for themselves to suffer versus being in communion with God, when they're at the end of their life and they're choosing between staying on this earth for as long as God allows them to endure that suffering for whatever purpose that may be, or allowing someone else to euthanize them so that they can be in communion with God and experience this eternal joy. What are your comments on that, I guess?
Oh, the decision for a Catholic, the decision to accept euthanasia or to not take it.
Right.
Okay, that's a really good question. So I'm against it, as you won't be surprised to learn. And I think it's really important that you sort of pointed to the sort of accepting suffering for whatever purpose God entails. Now, there is absolutely a mystery in the purposes that God has for our lives. And you're entirely right that when we accept some of these things, we can't see what God might be bringing out of them. But part of that purpose is signaling to those around us that life is worthwhile even in the midst of suffering. And there are people out there around us, I guarantee you, there are people around each suffering person who need that comfort, who will take heart from seeing someone who suffers maybe extremely, but is not willing to say, no, I give up, is not trying to jump through the process of suffering, but says, okay, this is this is the cross I've been given. This is what God has asked me in love to walk with. And this is what I'm going to do. The act of love, of accepting and bearing that suffering with grace, is something that, I mean, you see this all the time. And those, I'm sure Dr. Carlino has seen this in the hospital, where someone who suffers with grace and love becomes an inspiration to everyone around them. I've certainly seen this in people that I know who have done it, who really inspire me. And I continue to think about those people, some of whom are no longer here on earth or with God, regularly. And they inspire me to try to be better in my own life and more patient, more accepting of suffering, more kind and compassionate to the people around me. by accepting that, you communicate to those people something about who you are, and even more than that, who God is, and sort of the reality and perpetuity of love. And by rejecting that opportunity, by taking euthanasia, you close off the opportunity to send that message to people, many of whom you won't end up knowing. In some ways, it's kind of like raising a child. If you raise a child well, most parents love their children and get an enormous amount of satisfaction and happiness from seeing their children grow up well and be faithful sons and daughters to them. But a parent only ever, so to speak, captures a tiny portion of what that child is going to do in the world. They put an enormous amount into that person, and that person goes out, and most of their impact reaches other people the parents will never know. And so I think it becomes, at least for Catholics, and not really, there's a lot to be said about when we should or should not use the power of the state to enforce some of these rules. But there's an enormous, I think there's a strong moral imperative for us to accept them for ourselves and to accept the reality that our actions have these meanings that go beyond us and that our lives are inevitably signs. Does that make sense? Thank you. Anyone else? We got a couple questions. Okay, over here. Let's go here in the front first and then back here. Anthony, how much time before you need to take them?
Don't worry about it.
Okay, we'll go up here. What's your name?
Caitlin,
Kaylin, thank you.
in general.
Mhm.
Self-law,
Uh-huh.
could you argue that it is self-taught? And if it is, does that, how directly does that implicate the effects on society? So if individuals are self-governing of themselves, they have autonomy, well, who is to say that their effects on what they choose influences society?
I think I'm following. It's a really good question. Maybe can I ask you a question to see if I've got it? So you're asking how are you asking about how we know what the effects of our actions, what the meanings that people take from our actions are, or are you asking about how we come to be autonomous, like how we learn?
Society.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's a really good question. So I'm going to sort of throw out a few thoughts. In the Enlightenment, it was commonly thought or assumed that this is sort of the natural state of human beings, that adult humans, by virtue of our reason and our freedom, are autonomous. We should choose the laws of which we're a part. We should choose the lives we want to lead. What happened as the 18th moved into the 19th century is that a lot of those accounts of autonomy became narratives because it was sort of, there was more attention to the fact that no one is born autonomous. A newborn infant is a lot of things, but he's not a rational, self-determining being. That at some point we need to grow up into some kind of adult freedom. So that's why I tried to refer briefly. I had to sort of speed through the discussion of Huckleberry Finn. That's why I referred to Huckleberry Finn, because that's a story of a boy discovering his freedom of autonomous choice. And at the end of that novel, he says, "I'm going to light out for the territory ahead of the rest." Because the territory, the frontier, is where he can be free, where he can be himself. He's had to grow up out of society and into his kind of self-determination. And I think that's more how it's thought of today as well. Why is there so much encouragement to live your truth? If not because a lot of people are not living their truths. And sort of the way the story gets told is that, well, you come from a society and a family and a background that have given you put certain blinders on who you want to be. And so you've got to grow out of those. I think that a better way to think about a lot of those essentially inheritances is to think of them as well, as inheritances. We think of if you think sort of literally, an inheritance is a money that's passed down through the family. Most people are, you might not be happy, you probably aren't happy about the things that brought about an inheritance, meaning someone died, but most people are happy to get an inheritance. And I think that the rules, the customs, the guidelines that have been handed down to us are much better thought of as an inheritance that includes with it some problematic things. If you inherit a house, there might be some cracks in the foundation. It may not be a perfect house. There may be some work for you to do to make it more than what was given to you. But it's probably not going to be a great idea to set everything behind and just say, I'm only going to do what I want to do, to set that inheritance behind. So that is sort of why we have these narratives of the emergence of autonomy, and then why we have these stories of people sort of finding that autonomy is not what they thought it was. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question. Does it give you enough that you want to rephrase the question or ask a follow-up? Okay, okay. Thank you, Kaylin. And we had a question back there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what you thought about more passive form of euthanasia, like in cases where the patient themselves can't survive on their own, like maybe they're on a ventilator or feeding tube, and they wish to be removed from that, just die on their own.
So the first thing I would say is that I'm not a moral theologian. Father, you don't happen to be a moral theologian there in the back, are you?
That wouldn't be considered euthanasia. Euthanasia would have to be the intentional action to end life, right? Catholic moral theology, and I'm not an expert, but as defined in the Catechism, we need not avail ourselves to extraordinary means to sustain life. So, for example, a patient with end-stage pancreatic cancer, there's no moral obligation that to give them a feeding tube or to put them on a machine, a respirator, a ventilator to breathe for them. In certain cases, though, those interventions could be ordinary, not extraordinary. You had a 6-year-old with a broken leg who needed support to broken leg is not the best example, but support to breathe or eat, and that would be ordinary, right? There's no in that case they're not they have something treatable. They have an entire life ahead of them. It would not be considered futile care.
Thank you. All right, any more questions? Yes, back here.
In today's society, I feel a lot of influence from society. And only try to be peace. And I want to ask, do you think that it's possible in today's society to be peace?
Good question. I think that's actually the question that O'Connor is asking. And I think her answer is to call attention to some of these moments when the very act of claiming autonomy is actually going along with what society says. So suppose that you say, well, look, it's really important. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. What was your name?
My name is Jay.
Jay. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Suppose you say, look, Really important. You got to live your truth. Did you invent that phrase? No, you didn't, right? I certainly didn't. I heard it from some fitness guy online, who I'm sure also did not invent it, who heard it from somebody else. These ideas circulate. There's a really interesting, I'm going to go to another great novel from the 1980s by a guy named Don DeLillo. It's called White Noise. In that novel, you've got a father who is trying to connect with his, I think, 13-year-old daughter, and he finds her asleep one day. And she's whispering something in her sleep. He thinks, oh, she's dreaming. I can, like, you know, early teenagers can be hard to understand. From an adult's perspective, adults can be hard to understand from a teenager's perspective. A lot of miscommunication. He thinks, I wonder what she, like, deep down, the guardrails are all down, what's she thinking? And he thinks if he can hear what she's dreaming about, he'll finally know his daughter. He reaches down and he listens to her, and she whispers, Toyota Corolla. Her unconscious mind is replaying this image. It seems like there's maybe some ad, a jingle that she saw on TV or something. It's replaying something that's come in there. And I think that is a similar idea to what O'Connor is exploring, the way that this sort of sense of self-discovery is actually a repetition of what we've been taught. That Emersonian originality and autonomy is actually what in our society we're very frequently told that's what you should be going for. I'm not sure it's actually possible to distinguish between those ideas that are truly my own because they well up from within and those ideas that come to me from outside, which is why I'm trying to critique. Remember, Emerson said that the line between good and evil is between what is truly my own, what comes from within, and what comes from society. He said there's really no good, there's no good except what's in accord with my constitution, no bad except what's against it. I don't think we can ever know what comes from deep within. I don't think that's a distinction that we can credibly and consistently understand. And so I think that's why it makes actually a lot more sense to look at all of these different things that well up from us through a lens more of what's good and evil. And that's a lens that we're going to actually have to bring from society. So it's not just a question of whether I can escape society's influences. It's, are society's influences really bad? Very often they're not. Very often they teach us things that we need. Other times they are bad. And that's the process of personal discernment that each of us has to go through. Does that answer your question, Jay?
Yeah, thank you.
Back here, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, earlier in the discussion, you were talking about how we could learn about our own actions.
Mhm.
And I want to ask, maybe since something like a reflex is something that naturally comes from ourselves, maybe is that something we could learn about just as much as we can learn from actions we consciously think about?
A reflex is something that sort of, give me that language again. Reflex comes sort of.
Like a reflex is something that comes from yourself without any thought. So even observing your own reflexes to certain situations, you could learn just as much from observing your conscious actions.
Really good question. What was your name?
Larry?
Larry, thank you. Okay, so a reflex is something that comes without conscious thought. Absolutely right. Does a reflex come intuitively without any framing from the outside? No, it doesn't. Do we have any Yankees fans here? Yeah, some Yankees fans. Okay. I can swing a baseball bat, and I'm going to do it mostly on reflex. Aaron Judge swings a baseball bat. There is something of reflex. There is something of his innate talent in there. But there's also years of training and coaching that have gone into what is now a reflexive activity for him. When he swings, he's not doing all of the thinking that's needed to swing properly and be able to hit the pitch coming. He doesn't have time for that. But it's also not a sort of purely a pure expression of himself. So I'm not sure that the reflex versus choice distinction actually marks a sort of self versus society distinction or maps onto it. Is that the question you were asking, or the?
In a sense.
Okay, do you want to?
Maybe like an additional example would be like your conscious reaction to a reflex. Like, give me an example if you were walking with like a younger sibling or a child or something, and maybe like a ball came out of somewhere, you could have a reflex to either protect the person you're with or protect yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe you could learn about yourself from reflexes like that.
Oh, that's a really good example. That your reflex actually tells you something about yourself. I see. Yeah. Yeah. So that would be, and that reflex may or may not be something that sort of welled up naturally within. It's not necessarily, you're not necessarily saying that whether you grab your younger sibling or whether you duck out of the way yourself, that you're expressing the way you were born. This may be something that you've learned over time through a whole series of actions of either choosing to watch out for other people or choosing to prefer yourself. But in that moment, without your really consciously choosing it, you've revealed to the world and you've also revealed to yourself. You've learned something. That is a fantastic point. Thank you.
All righty.
Anything else? All right. Thank you. Thank you all.